Jean-Paul Mutari, who is from the private sector, to introduce himself. 20 seconds, Jean.
Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. I represent a holding company, private, in Rwanda, which is an agricultural supply chain manager with different subsidiaries along agricultural value chains. The first one being Bramin, which is a joint venture with Heineken, fully mechanized and irrigated land on which we farm. Second one called Prodev Rwanda, which is an infrastructure of post-harvest activities where we clean, dry, and store different commodities. And the third one being Minimex. Minimex being the largest maize mill in Rwanda and also operates the largest feed mill in Rwanda. Thank you.
Thank you for using the 20 seconds. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having time this afternoon. Now, Dr. Chaponda, back in the 1960s and 70s, Africa was a net food exporter. Yes, sir. And, in the 80s and 70s, something happened, and we started importing in food on a very massive scale, a trend that is still happening even up to now. The African Development Bank actually estimates that if this is not fixed, by 2030, we'll be importing food worth over $100 billion annually. If I may ask, what happened? What explains this trend? Just put it back, please. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you, Maggie. What happened is that in Malawi, we have passed through a period in which the climatic situation has influenced the way things have been happening. Why am I saying this? First of all, in one would say in the country as such, as you know, Malawi, 80% of the people are involved in one way or the other in the agriculture sector. Agriculture accounts for 30% of the GDP. But then the challenge which has been there in terms of the imports and versus exports is that for a long time Malawi depends on maize and tobacco. Now, in the 60s, obviously, the population was less. But at the same time, the effect of the weather had a determining effect on the country. In the for instance, because of the erratic situation of the weather pattern, in 1990s to 1994 and 1995, we found that the drought situation affected the crop production in the country. So as a result of that, we find that while tobacco production continued, we did have a challenge in terms of the maize production because it was less. And that is why, as we reached in the 2005, we now decided that we have to go effectively in terms of seeing how we deal with the issue of our agriculture production.
Talking about 2005, let's take a look at the subsidy program that you introduced then. It was a massive success, but along the way, some donors said it was actually expensive. I think $188 million was spent in that. Let's talk about what other countries can learn from the Malawi experience.
The
subsidy program.
The subsidy program, you are right. That is the one which now we introduced in the time of the late Bingwa Mtarika. There was a lot of resistance from the donor community. They felt that it was not necessary, that the people had to go, had to receive subsidy in terms of fertilizer. But we did it anyway. And I must say that the result was a great success. The agriculture production in terms of maize went up from 1.33 million metric tons to 3.33 million metric tons. And I think, as you may know, at that time, Malawi was heralded as one of the countries where we were self-sufficient in terms of food production. Even at the African Union, Malawi's name was at the forefront. The president then, Professor Bim Wamtarika, was the chair of the African Union, and this issue of food security was on top of the agenda. However, from 2005 up to 2010, success total of Malawi was very good. We were in fact even exporting maize to the neighboring countries, and everything looked rosy. But then come this erratic rainfall, El Nino, or
so you didn't prepare for that.
That's
we'll come back to that. Dr. Simmons, you didn't seem to agree with what he said earlier on to what the donors said when the program was actually rolling out in 2005.
Well, I wasn't involved in the decision-making from the UK government's perspective to provide the donor financial support to deliver the subsidy programme. And instinctively, being an ex-centre-right politician, I'm nervous about subsidies because I don't think they're sustainable longer term. But I think the reason why it worked in Malawi, and it did work, was because the fertiliser input the cost was too high. And the only way it was affordable to the farmers and the producers in Malawi was through some subsidy mechanism through the government. So the solution to that is reducing the price of fertiliser and getting the producers cheaper and faster access to the input.
Sorry to cut you, but Europe spends a lot of money in actually subsidizing, and yet you're against the African governments to do this. Why? How do you explain that?
Well, of course, the United Kingdom does not 100% support the European Union Common Agricultural Policy. And all of you will be aware that the UK has just voted to leave the European Union. And one of the positive elements that I think will come out of that vote is that the constraints that the Common Agricultural Policy in the European Union put on African exporters will disappear, specifically related to the United Kingdom. So I think that actually from African agriculture, one of the positive side effects of the UK leaving the EU will be that we will be able to get back to a much more free trade in agricultural products between the African continent and the United Kingdom.
We're coming back to that in regards to the subsidy, because I think there's so much we need to talk about. But Pierre, you seem to agree with what he's saying.
Well, yeah, because if you have a subsidy program that is working properly, what I would call a smart subsidy program, where it's integrated, you have all the value chain, you have all the experts, you have people working with farmers, especially extension agents, to focus on agricultural productivity. If we get, for instance, a forecast of agricultural needs from the UK, and you pass that down onto the farmers, because you always start with the market. So if you start with the market and you go down to source specific fertilizer based on the products, the final products that a buyer in the UK might need, I think it's a good thing for Africa to have smart subsidy program when you have an output buyer at the end.
Okay, talking about the markets, Honorable Minister Jardine, you know, for Rwanda, it has achieved significant success in reforming its agricultural sector, but we still have a few challenges, you know, the markets and then the climate change. I just want you to share with us some measures that can be taken to improve this.
I mean,
I think we need to press this. It was actually on.
I mean, the agriculture in Rwanda has been trying its best, not 100%, because, I mean, as he was mentioning about the smart subsidy, I mean, having tiny pieces of land and all the hilly topography of Rwanda, all of them, they come with different challenges, but this government has been trying to look at it in a holistic way, looking at the farm sizes, trying to consolidate, looking at input facilitation for the farmers to be able to have access to them. That's where comes the smart subsidy. When you start by, you have a progressive way of exiting as the government, where the private sector is taking over. But also looking at the harvest, post-harvest, and markets. So all of those, they come with their own way of challenging whoever is doing it. But in our case of Rwanda, having a marketing strategy has been something that was not an easy thing, as it takes aggregation, because we having farmers scattered all over, it's not an easy thing, but when you put them together, they produce together, they have access to inputs and equipments, it gets easier to aggregate when you are also investing in facilities like transportation facilities, post-harvest facilities, for being able to tell the buyer this is where the products are. But also having access to finance has been another nightmare. But another approach that we are trying to promote is financing value chains. It includes all of the stakeholders into the value chains so that they are linked with the financial institutions. But those are the models that we are trying to build up along the public and the private partnership to make sure that the farmers are having access. But all of these, they take time, and it's important to look at them, all the value chains, because if farmers are producing and are not having a market, they will very fast leaving what they are doing, because what they are having is not producing the expected results.
Let's move to Jean-Paul. We'll actually come back to access to finance, because I think it's very critical to discuss that. It's one of the challenges we're having. Jean-Paul, as we're asking governments to come up with all these policies and to increase productivity, I want to speak to you as a producer in Rwanda. What are some of the things that you have come up with? What are you doing as a producer to see that you also market your products and also increase productivity?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I think we need some.
No? Okay. Thanks, Maggie. Actually, sometimes we have to also look at the positive side of things. And I'm just going to give a quick example of some of the initial challenges we faced when we started, and relate it to a bit of the Rwandan story. When we started in 2006, we, instead of starting upstream and going downstream, started downstream, and there were some inefficiencies along the maize value chain. We set up a state-of-the-art mill, only to find out that the supply chain of maize wasn't there. It was very hard to have access to raw materials. On one hand, because maize was not yet a staple food in Rwanda, so people had not yet gotten used to plant it, as there was no maize industry. But also, even those who were doing it inefficiently. Then, in parallel, as we were trying to move upstream in order to create a sort of supply chain through post-harvest facilities, the government did a very good job with its crop intensification program.
Yeah.
What it did, it reunited different farmers. So where you had one farmer having half a hectare, could not take advantage of any economies of scale, they regrouped them into cooperatives. And that changed the mindset of having a farmer who is planting in a mindset of subsistence agriculture, but instead they were more market-oriented. On top of that, so that was the land consolidation program. On top of that, there was different programs to encourage farmers to use inputs. So that also increased yields, I think from 2, and now we should be at around 4%. So with the continued effort to invest in the people and have them have access to new technologies and financial services such as loans, insurances, that should really create a pool in terms of agricultural productivity. Because as the population is growing at 2%, we do not have, our land is not growing. So we must increase.
So even before you prepared for the drought and everything else, you had done the preparations?
As far as we are concerned, yes. As a private sector, we did invest in irrigation systems in a land that is fully mechanized. Of course, it's capital intensive, but we are now seeing the results because where the national average is around 4 tons per hectare on maize, we are between 8 and 9.
That's what I really wanted to hear. So you prepared for that, and in Malawi, the government did not prepare for that. How come?
Well, in Malawi, we have noticed that for years we have been depending on rain-fed agriculture. But what happened in 2014, 2015, 2015, 16 has been a different story. We had a situation where it was flooding in the southern region, when in the north it was dry spells, and in the center it was dry spells. That affected our food production. Again, in 2015, 2016, we had the flooding in the north, and well, in the south and center, we had dry spells. As a result, our food production was badly affected. Because of this, we have decided now not to depend entirely on rain-fed agriculture. We are now concentrating on irrigation farming, and for this, we are soliciting support to work in partnership with the private sector. And we are investing heavily in Lower Shire, in building canals, of course, in anticipation for the La Nina, since we have passed through the El Nino. And we are very confident that if we prepare ourselves effectively, including water harvesting and storage, all these things will help to deal with the situation. In fact, we have noticed that if we really concentrate on irrigation farming, it is possible to have a harvest of maize maybe 3 times.
That's after we've seen that it wasn't sustainable actually to go with the production that we had started with. That explains and what I was thinking, that maybe we don't do research.
Yes.
And now that you know you have to do irrigation, by the time you do something else, you realize there's something else you did wrong. And then, again, it will be coming back. Pierre, why haven't African governments actually invested so much in research and extension services?
Well, that would probably be a...
I just want you to speak as a researcher and... yes.
Well, I know that the governments... They are aware that to really have, to help bring agriculture contribution to national GDP, they have to invest in research. They need to create agro ecosystem. But as you probably know, the contribution to national GDP on agri, probably outside of Rwanda and certain other countries, is going down in most African countries. So there's more money going towards inputs, maybe capacity building, but none for research. I don't think the African government need to invest so much into research when there's organization like IFPRI out of the World Bank, and you have the private sector that has research capacity, like say Nestle in Cote d'Ivoire, for instance. So what government could do is probably partner with private sector and using the capacity of the research, from the private sector, and help use some of the research findings to commercialize them. Because I am sure, and the Honorable might even agree, that in every single government, there's plenty of research findings. They're just not being utilized.
Honorable, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean...
and yet we haven't invested in it.
I mean, I cannot say that this government has not invested in research, because what we are seeing here sustaining agriculture still comes from research institutions. But probably the African research was not so much streamlined to take advantage of education and research being linked, because you find still you find university there training students in agriculture, and it's called education. And then there is something else that is called National Research Institution. That is still sitting somewhere else. So this connection of using this huge amount of massive skills that are generated at university to translate them into tangible activities, probably that's where we are falling behind. But still, I say that African research institutions, they have done their best, especially the time we are speaking, the international research institutes were scattered all over in Africa. And probably the African nations thought that they can, I call them field trials of international research institutes, because they would develop varieties, they would develop something else, and then it goes to be field tested in in the country. So probably looking at it into a holistic way, that's where we are now heading, and I think research has contributed a bit.
Dr. Simmons, I saw you nodding your head when Pierre was saying something. You have something to say?
Well, I was agreeing very strongly with the point that a couple of the panellists have made about the importance of research. And, of course, 10 of the world's top 20 agricultural research institutions are in the United Kingdom. And I think would love to have links with research institutions in specific African countries to help build capacity. Whilst, of course, there is significant agricultural research in some African countries, it's not uniform at all. And I also think there's there are some very significant challenges which are currently inhibiting foreign direct investment coming into the agricultural sector in the scale that is required to help build capacity in the way that you were referring to earlier. You know, security of land tenure, affordability of inputs, infrastructure, getting goods to markets, being able to transfer subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture and then to industrial agriculture, as well as, of course, the ultimate purchaser, which in the United Kingdom and Europe are the supermarkets. And certainly from my perspective, it's not acceptable that supermarkets are coming into certain parts of Africa and importing goods to sell in those supermarkets, not sourcing locally. So agricultural ministers and others in the key component parts of this need to make sure that supermarkets coming into jurisdictions are sourcing products from local producers to help create jobs and added value in those countries.
Dr. Simmons, I want us to talk about markets, access to markets for the farmers. In regards to the European and high-income countries, having traditionally subsidized their own agriculture sectors enormously. Because we see that we have the European Common Agriculture Policy, which I understand that in the UK, 50% of the farm incomes comes from the European subsidies, something you could lose with Brexit. Like you said, it wasn't really a problem. But the question is it fair that high-income countries subsidize their own agriculture to such an extent? Doesn't it distort the global prices, food prices?
In some sectors, the short answer is yes, it does. And it's not acceptable. And certainly the United Kingdom government, of which I was part of, and to be fair, predecessor governments, argued very strongly that the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe needs to change for that very reason, which is why I made the point that I did earlier. But I think ultimately what needs to happen, as with any economic sector, if it's going to be sustainable, is that the government needs to create the architecture and the rules, and the agricultural producers and those supplying the inputs need to get together privately without the government being involved. And to give credit to Malawi and the agriculture minister who's sitting here, they have put in place an agricultural commodity exchange which will do exactly that. And that will be the main driver of making sure that producers can access fertiliser and other inputs and also sell their goods far faster into the marketplace without having to go through middlemen who inevitably take a cut and put up the price and sometimes make it unaffordable to the consumer. So if there's one message I would like to put across today on this panel is look at the opportunity for commodity exchanges in your country which will enable your producers to go straight to the market rather than having to go through the government.
With that, I just want to see if we have a few questions from the audience. I thought I would see a lady, but yes, the gentleman over there, can we give him a microphone?
Thank you, the panel. The minister from Malawi just mentioned that 80% agriculture impacts directly or indirectly the African population. Now, but I wanted to question how much the African governments are investing in the agriculture that impacts that much on their population. The Maputo Declaration urges African governments to dedicate at least 10% of their budgets to agriculture. I think we should know how much African governments are investing. That also explains why the level of risk in the agriculture sector is still too high, and you're urging investors to put their money in that sector, which still has that level of risk. And you hear them talk about enabling environment, that governments just create enabling environments. And I'm still questioning how enabling is the agriculture environment in Africa. You have 8 times more tractors in Latin America than in Africa, 3 times more tractors in Asia than in Africa. Only 7% of the arable land in Africa is irrigated compared to some 40% in Asia. So what exactly are the African governments doing to agriculture, to improve agriculture, to make sure that the interested investors are sure or are safe with their money? Thank you.
You didn't tell us your name?
I'm Andrew from Uganda. Unfortunately, my minister has left.
It's unfortunate, really. Ladies and gentlemen, just to remind you, we're using a hashtag AgroInvest. You can send in your questions directly to the panelists. Please, if you can help me put their Twitter handles on the screens so that you can send them. I'm very sure they will be more than happy to respond to some of your questions and views after this session. So we'll take the questions after later on in the course of this session. At this particular point, I don't know who to point this to, but they said the Minister of Malawi.
Thank you.
You come in after him.
I think he's very much right that it is very important that African governments should put a lot of their monies in agriculture sector. And I fully agree that the Maputo Declaration did say 10%, and Malawi is committed to that 10%. Because under the G8 New Alliance on Food and Nutrition, there is an undertaking which has been made by the governments or our government together with the private sector and donors. And one of the conditions which we have agreed is that the government will undertake to commit 10% of the budget was agriculture, and that the donors themselves also will provide the necessary funds which are required. And also linked to it is the issue of enabling environment. I fully agree with him that there is need, if we have to attract private investors, there has to be an enabling environment. Some of the things which were already mentioned in the earlier session, I think from the President Kagame and the others, President Museveni, also of Uganda, the issue of the enabling environment is very important. And for Malawi, for instance, we have a Malawi Growth and Development Strategy. This is a term development strategy geared to attract investors to engage in infrastructure development. Linked to it also, we have now a new national agriculture policy. And one of the national agriculture policy is to have incentives, incentives which will attract investors to come to the country. For instance, low tariff, duty-free in other respects, so many other incentives, because obviously it's a competitive job. If you want one investor not to go maybe to one country to the other, there must be something which you have in your own country. Apart from that, you also need to have peace and security, which is very vital. We were told about the typical case of Rwanda, And there are quite a number of other African countries, including Malawi, where there is peace and security. The other issue is very important, the issue of political will. I think in most of the countries we know that where there is political will, especially from the above, people are encouraged to invest. And this is one of the elements which I think is very important.
You talked about the new regulation, sorry to cut you short, that you're coming up with the agriculture regulation.
Yes.
Is it operating right now, or is it something that you are just designing? One of the things they talked about in the morning that you yourself mentioned, the panelists, the presidents, was the issue of time. African governments saying they're going to do this, and it takes years and years and years. Yeah. Do we see this coming, this being put in place by the end of 2016?
Now, I want to tell you that the National Agriculture Policy has been adopted now. It's in implementation.
Now?
Yes, it has been adopted by the government, and we have now started implementing. As I agree with you, many times governments have a tendency of doing business as usual. But I think in Malawi now we want to move. And we move forward because of the political will. We want to change things to move in a different direction.
Dr. Simmons, you wanted to say something earlier on.
I just wanted to respond to the gentleman who asked the question, where I think he was absolutely right, that agriculture is an underplayed sector in Africa. There needs to be significantly more investment, particularly in the irrigation and drainage sector, part of the agriculture, because there is enough water in Africa, but it's not necessarily all in the right place at the right time. In the right part of the year. So that needs to be controlled far better than it has been historically. And of course, the really exciting thing about the agricultural sector, unlike extractives and oil and gas, is it creates jobs. And that's really what, in the next decade, many parts of Africa are going to need, sustainable jobs.
I want to quote you, Dr. Simmons, in regards to the agriculture sector. On 2 occasions, you talked about how the environment in Africa hasn't been favorable, from what the gentleman there really said. And that was at the Barclays Africa Forum in 2013, where you say that many companies are put off by what you called the old agenda. I don't know if you remember that. And the worry that doing business in Africa is too risky because there is corruption, war, and famine. I just want to hear your views. Would you describe, how would you describe the environment in Africa right now?
Well, I think there's a problem, and it's relevant not just for the agricultural sector, but across different economic sectors, of a perception in much of Europe and the United States about Africa. And it goes back to some of the points that I was making on the earlier panel, that the media, the mainstream media, don't portray Africa accurately. They only portray the negative parts and stories that come out of Africa, not the huge economic progress and economic development that's been generated in the last 15 or so years. There's also a lack of understanding of the diversity that exists in Africa. So many people in the UK and elsewhere believe that Africa is one country. They don't understand that it's 54 different countries, different diversities, etc., etc. So there needs to be a job, not just in the UK, but for Africa and countries and economic sectors in Africa to market themselves far more effectively.
So there's a misperception of the African continent. But you yourself, earlier on this year in February, you said, actually, the war, hunger, and famine is real.
Well, but you're taking what I said out of context. That, of course, is true.
So if you've been on the African continent for a long time...
that is true in some parts of Africa.
So do you think it's real?
So, well, there are. I mean, there are wars going on in some parts of Africa. So, but what we need, indeed in Nigeria, there is. So what you need to do is, what the media need to do is to make sure that the reporting of what is going on is accurate, is specific, is sophisticated, so investors can make informed decisions about where they should be investing and in what sectors they should be investing in. But I'm an African optimist, and Africa has made huge progress in the last decade or so. And I believe that now that the economic growth and economic development genie is out of the bottle in Africa, you cannot put it back in. So we've all got to work together to make sure that we maximise the investment coming into Africa for the maximum benefit of the maximum number of African people.
Pierre, do you have something to say about that?
Oh yeah, I agree, because Africa has the youngest population, and in all the countries in Africa, the focus should be in youth in agribusiness. to answer the question from our Ugandan delegate, if we want to catch up to Asia, US, and Europe, we cannot continue to do small holding farming. We cannot continue with the farmers that we have who are 55 years old and older. We have to focus on the youth. We have to focus on latest technology. We have to focus on mechanized agriculture. And this is the only way we're going to move forward with agricultural productivity. The focus has to be on the youth.
Honorable Minister Georgine, yes.
Yeah, I mean, hearing the discussions here, I think the problem is that Africa has been taken like a country. So you hear China, Africa, India, Africa. I think this is creating a problem, and I think I think the President Museveni in the morning mentioned something like, go where the peace is and the enabling environment is. And I think that needs to be specifically mentioned where, because when someone is thinking Africa as a whole, I think that is creating a problem. But coming back to the question of the gentleman, I think a lot has been said, but some African countries, they did their best to abide on the Maputo Declaration, because like this government has been recognizing that agriculture is not just a way of living. It's contribute to economic development. It contributes to food security and everything that is associated with it. And it takes a nation to know that this is where you are looking at to grow your economy. And then once you are convinced of that, you can invest in it. So this country has been even passing the 10% allocation that is required. And when you look at like big irrigation facilities in this country, they come from the public money. When you look at all of these facilities in post-harvest and everything, they come from the public money. So I think this is the time when the public is calling the private to join in those specific environment to make sure that we are moving ahead, because only the public cannot make a difference. It takes a partnership between different parties to make a difference.
I want us to touch something really important here, especially on the African continent, which is land. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, 90 to 98% of the land in Africa belongs to the state. Farmers own less than 10%. It's really a sad story. So, to the policymakers, the Minister of Agriculture of Rwanda and the Minister of Agriculture of Malawi, I just want to know, how do we get farmers to actually own this land so that they can reinvest in their businesses?
Actually,
for Rwanda, it's done a really good job. So
actually, in this country, if there is anything that is easy, is the land access, because the land belongs to the private. The land belongs to the people. So that said, these farmers, they need to, I mean, if you are in a country like Rwanda, I don't think that you can totally forget about the small-scale farmers, because those are the people that are going to be even, feeding the nation.
Those are the people who own the land. Honorable Minister Chaponda, in the case of Malawi, 75% of the country's 2.4 million smallholders are subsistent farmers who have an average of less than 1 hectare of land. And if they have such small pieces of land, they're going to suffer serious food deficits. I just want you to tell me what your thoughts are on this, and what you're doing to ensure that actually farmers own this land so that they can feel like I'm actually making my own investment.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we have under the G8 new alliance on food security and nutrition. One of the conditions, among others, in this agreement was that Malawi had to come out on a land bill which has to sort out a lot of these things. I'm pleased to say that in the last sitting of Parliament, the land bill was passed. This land bill, it took us around about maybe 4 years of discussion, consultation, meeting the chiefs and so on. So now that is an issue which is settled. We know, as you rightly said, Maggie, that the land in Malawi, we have a lot of these smallholder farmers, they own pieces of land and so on. The good news now is that a smallholder farmer can register that piece of land.
And own it.
And it will use it as a security. It is also means that that piece of land which is registered will also be benefit to the family. And even if the man or the woman dies, whichever it is, it will pass on. So it is acting now as part of the security. So I think we have done in a move in the right direction. Related to this, of course, is that there is also other land, customary land. Now, that customary land, if it has to be disposed of, maybe for some public activity and so on, there is a committee, land committees, which have been established, and the issue will be discussed publicly, and then a decision is taken. We have done this because in the past, in Malawi, sometimes people would, especially at the community level, the chiefs would take actions which would not be in the best interest of others. But this will be an issue of the past in the new act.
That's good to hear that we're leaving it in the past. I'm sure by the end of this session, so many things would have changed. Yeah. Pierre, I understand in Ghana, you're trying to make sure that the kings, actually invest into agro-business. I just want you to tell me agribusiness. I just want you to tell me about that experience.
Yeah, I mean, we have to find different ways to approach the issue of land. And so what we're doing in Ghana is working with the traditional chiefs and get them involved in agribusiness. And what we explained to them was that agribusiness and agriculture, it's not just about food security. We keep forgetting, and especially for the investors here, in agriculture you also get output for the cosmetic industry, you get output for pharmaceutical, and you get output for when you get output from cocoa and tea and coffee, etc. So we explained to them that the region that they occupy, it's owned by what they call the stool chiefs, stool lands. So we met with about 50 of those chiefs. They agreed to use the entire region for agribusiness, and now they ask us to come back to select a few groups of youth and women and create categories of crops to be developed under food security, edible, cosmetics, and pharmaceutical, so that each community that has a comparative advantage for a certain type of production will add value to what they have on the land. So this is the only way we could be done, because smallholder farmers don't have really access to the land that they could grow some commodities for which they can add value and get out of poverty. So we use the chiefs.
Dr. Simmons, has this been a challenge to some of the impact investors on the African continent trying to invest in agribusiness?
Yes, it has. I mean, of course, the challenge with agriculture is it can either be at the very large scale or it can be at the micro end. And so there's a range and a spectrum of support mechanisms that are available coming from the UK and elsewhere. And one of the elements that is often missing is an understanding that actually there is particularly finance available from the developmental organisations at a very micro scale. For example, to help a community lease a tractor to enable all 40 acres that the village owns to be ploughed and to be producing agricultural produce, not just that which they can do by hand. And there's also sort of ways that the irrigation can be paid for through these mechanisms as well, with no interest payments. And I'm not sure that all African governments and agricultural ministries are quite switched on yet to the funding that is available, that comes through not just the traditional multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, but others as well, coming through the African Development Bank and DFID in the case of the United Kingdom as well. So I think that there needs to be more imaginative thinking in making sure that the maximum number number of Africans are really benefiting from the agricultural base once the land tenure issue is sorted out. Because there's no doubt, if you look at economic history throughout the world, that people being able to borrow money using the land as their security has been a major driver for economic growth.
The policymakers just assured us that for Rwanda it's in the past, but for Malawi he told us it's going to be in the past from now. I want to move to Jean-Paul, because I want to find out, as a producer, how much do you spend on these fertilizers?
On fertilizers, chemicals, seed, and different inputs, spend about 50%, 46 to 50%
of the cost,
of our cost
digital
of
cost.
production, yes.
Which is quite a lot of money. I don't know, are there any possibilities of having those actually made in Africa or in our countries?
There should be possibilities, at least if I start from the seed, there's definitely possibilities of multiplying seed. We should not keep importing. When it comes to other inputs, because they have to go through some kind of processing, it will depend on the size of the market. But we can look at the Rwandan market, and all of that will depend on the sensitization from authorities to the users to use those inputs, and also the possibilities of finding off-takers locally and regionally. But definitely, it's a possibility.
I want to go to Honorable Minister from Malawi in regards to that, because in one of the reports on the Malawi's fertilizer subsidies, they say that farmers obtained hybrid maize seeds produced by 3 international companies in competition with one another, which means we were importing. So we were investing a lot of money in things that we are importing from outside the continent. I just want to know, is there anything we're putting in place to see that we can have this actually made on the continent?
Well, I must say that currently we are in serious negotiation with a Chinese company that is interested in investing in the fertilizer plant factory in Malawi, and it will make a difference. Of course, nowadays we have scaled down in a way. In the past, for instance, last year we had spent 1.5 million. We had spent around 62 billion kwacha, which is our local currency there, and the beneficiaries were around about 1.5 million people. But this year it has been scaled down to 900,000. We have concentrated on productive farmers, those who have pieces of land. The other ones, they are going to receive assistance through other social services, cash for transfer, sometimes public works activities and so on. But at the end of the day, as I was saying, we think that when we have this fertilizer produced in the country, it will make a difference.
Saves us a lot of money.
It will make a difference.
Because we have a few minutes, actually we run out of time, but I want to touch something important to Jean-Paul. This research says that contract farming often introduces new technologies and enables farmers to learn new skills. Just give me your own perspective. Is this something that has worked for you, and if it has, what best practices can other farmers probably learn from you?
Contract farming, we do contract farming with farmers and cooperatives. In some cases, it has worked. In some others, it hasn't, because the productivity side of it was not matching the contract. We would contract cooperative for, 1,000 tons, but they could only deliver probably 50 to 60% of that. Another problem that we've noticed was the organization of cooperatives themselves. Sometimes it's a cooperative on paper, but people themselves don't think as a cooperative. Although that is changing, we are seeing that they are getting more organized. We are in partnership with different NGOs to really monitor their progress, and we have a way to track the progress of delivery and organization against contract. So the other thing we do on our farm is becoming a nucleus farm which can help surrounding communities come learn best practices on that particular farm. So
that's very important because cooperatives have worked for Rwanda tremendously. I live here, I know, and Honorable Minister would know from you later on. But I want to go to Honorable Minister of Malawi. I'm sorry to ask all these questions, but there's really a lot. And in terms of contract farming, it has proven to be the best way forward for tobacco in your country. And I understand that the market of tobacco is also as competitive in the neighboring countries in Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Yeah. Have you taken any serious steps of saying that you actually put a lot of effort in this so that investors do not run away from Malawi and go to the neighboring countries?
Yes, we have improved the mechanism.
How?
We have improved in the sense that in this new alliance, G8 New Alliance on Food Security and Nutrition, one of the requirements is to come out on a new contract farming agreement. This is a contract farming between the buyers of tobacco and the smallholder farmers, creating what we call a win-win situation. Because, tobacco is one of these areas where the buyer has the price and the smallholder farmer gets all the inputs and so on, and in the end maybe does not benefit as much as he or she could. But under this arrangement, under this contract, new revised contract agreement, it will ensure that the smallholder farmer can at least benefit something.
Which you said is started now.
It's already done.
Thanks. As we wind up, Honorable Minister Jardine, we can't go without touching on technology. It plays a very important role. I'm sorry we're not going to take questions, but please use hashtag. I'm sorry about that, but data actually plays a very important role in agribusiness because I understand farmers investors need to know where should I put my money, which company does this, how can I find that. I just want you to tell us innovative ways that governments need to adopt to actually improve the agribusiness sector.
Actually, the information on investment opportunities that are in the country needs to be available. And I think the government of Rwanda has done a good job in creating RDB, and we don't have as a sectors to deal with all of that. So what we do is just profiling our investment opportunities and hand them to them so that they can do a job. But it's also important to include the ICT technologies into everything that we are doing, because that is the job, but also it gives the information of what's going on. It even facilitate extension services that we are providing to our farmers. So it's important to think in a way that anything that can integrate the technologies, to make sure that you are integrating it in there.
Contribute to the conversation on Twitter, but I'm now winding up with just one question. I don't want you to go with your money. I want you to leave it in Rwanda. So I'm giving you the question on on the basis that you... Okay. I'm sorry, yes. In less than 5 seconds.
I'll try. My name is Karanveer Singh. I come from a very populous country called India. We have 1.3 billion people that we feed. And I was talking to the minister earlier today, and I just wanted to ask the August panel. We have created a huge problem for ourselves because we had the green revolution, because we want to increase yield. We started using fertilizer, pesticides, got into a continuous loop. We've got metabolic syndrome. We are the world's highest per capita today for heart disease and for diabetes. I see that a lot of countries today are not using chemical fertilizer. and therefore don't require chemical pesticides. What do you plan to do?
Honorable Minister for Malawi, is that okay? I'll give you less than a minute to answer that. Could you please help me?
Yeah, we discussed that, but the question is that Africa did not catch the green revolution because it did not use the technologies that the rest of the world was using. So as we speak, in this country we are using 30 kilograms per hectare. In Asia, you are using 90 kilograms per hectare. In America, they are using 250 kgs per hectare. So the most important is knowing how much dosage you are using, and probably as the technologies are coming, making sure that you are producing organic fertilizers and so on. But I think Africa needs to use fertilizers to get somewhere where it can feed itself. Coming to the pesticides, I mean, it's a market requirement that the pesticides residues are checked whenever you are selling or exporting. So it's important that countries are thinking of various ways of controlling pests instead of pumping in a lot of pesticides. But I think it's okay.
Okay.
I just want to very quickly say something to the questioner. You need to make sure that being used are organic, environmentally friendly fertilizers, so the environmental damage is not done and the health is not done as in the way you were suggesting as has happened, both in some parts of the UK and India more recently. But also, if there are subsidies to be used, it's to be used in environmental protection. If I just give you one example of technology, there is now a drone technology that exists with a camera on it that can fly over land and tell you how much fertilizer you should be using to maximize the yield on that piece of land.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for being such an amazing audience. I'm sorry, Peter, we had to take this long. This is such an important sector. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to Maggie Mutesi, who's with Rwanda TV and her panel. Let's give him a big hand, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so I know that you've been